Hi, I'm Linda, and some of the people in the guild have asked me several times when I've shown a quilt that I've made how I quilted it. And I do it in sections because it's too difficult for me to quilt a queen size or a larger quilt on my home sewing machine. It's too physically hard to do. So I found Martin Michelle's book on how to quilt a quilt in sections years ago, and that's the way I've been doing it ever since. So what I do is I do my blocks in rows. I get them layered. I layer the batting and the backing, and however many sashing strips I've got on each one. I quilt this section, whether it's a column or a square or whatever, and then I put them together. All right, so here I have 2 rows of blocks that I've sewn together. Put one of the sides I've put sashing on. I've layered it with batting and backing, and you can see I have generous amounts of batting and backing around each row. So I have plenty to work with. It won't be a problem of running short. So the next step would be to pin this row to this row so I can sew them together. So I'm going to flip this one over, and then all you do is, like you would if you didn't have backing and batting, you pin at your intersections. I'm going to pin the end. Okay, you peel back. Okay. Now here's the sashing between the blocks. So I'm going to line that up and roll this out to the edge, and that's where I'm going to pin it. So you do this all the way down, matching your intersections of your sashing and your blocks. And after you've gotten it all pinned, you just make sure you keep your batting and your backing out of the way, which shouldn't be a problem. And you do your 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down, and sew your 2 front tops of your fabric, of your quilt together. And that's the next step before you trim the batting and the backing. So on the table I have 2 that I've sewn them together. I've sewn the sashing between these 2 together. So now I'm going to flip it over. Okay. And what I do is I peel back. I actually used fusible spray on this one to base the batting on and the backing. And so now I peel back the lining, the backing, and I overlap the batting like this, and you just get it smooth all the way down so there are no lumps. Okay. And then, excuse me, I'm going to get a pair of scissors. Don't use your good scissors for this because
don't cut through it all.
Yes, and don't cut through it all. But you cut both layers of the batting so that when you're done, they will butt up perfectly to each other. And you just be really careful. Keep your thumb kind of ahead of you so you don't cut into your fabric. But you just do this all the way up. When you're done, peel off the strips of batting, and your batting will butt up against each other, just like this. Now at this point, you can baste it loosely with, you know, just crisscrossing across it. You can baste it loosely. This is, as I said, this has the spray fusible on it, and so it's going to stick well enough that I won't have to do that. And then I can overlap my backing, and I'll trim that down, and then I'll hand stitch that closed. So when I get that far along, we'll do another little segment. All right, so now I have all the batting trimmed all the way through. And while I was doing that and talking to Judy Scott, I remembered I have these strips at home that are plastic, and they're different widths for cutting different widths of strips of fabric. I could have slid one of those in between the batting and the underneath of the front of the quilt so that I would never cut the layer of the quilt that's underneath, because the layer that's underneath is your top. So you can figure out ways to keep yourself from cutting into that layer. So now I have all the batting trimmed up. I've peeled off the strips of batting that were left after I did the cutting, and I fold over my backing, press that down. And remember, if you didn't use fusible, you'd have to do your basting stitch back and forth across here to hold your batting in place. Okay. And then you fold over the other side. And my next step will be to trim this down and turn it under so I can hand stitch it. So I will do that in just a few minutes.
This is just my mindless stuff.
All right, so now I'm ready to trim off the excess of the backing so that I can turn it under and hand stitch it down. So the way I do this is I find the edge of the fabric that I've overlapped. You can see it right there. And I butt the long ruler up against that edge. And now I'm going to mark a line on the fabric. I'm going to make it 1 inch wide, and then I can trim off that fabric. Don't have to have a very dark line, just something you can go by. There. Now I'm going to do that all the way down, and then I can come back and I can trim this off without worrying about it. Just get that one layer of fabric. Okay, and then I can tuck it under like that, and I'll be able to hand pin it and hand stitch that down, all the way down. So I've taken the back and I've trimmed out the batting, and I've overlapped the backing, and I've trimmed down one side of the backing, and I've folded it under the edges, and this is what it looks like when you're getting ready to stitch your backing together. So I've already trimmed the batting so it's butting up right next to each other. Then I've laid down one side, overlapped the other side. It was extended out to here, so I trimmed it down with a straight ruler to just 1 inch. Now I've folded under 1/2 inch, and I've pinned it in place, ready for me to hand stitch it closed. So that's how you put together each of your sections. So I just wanted to show you how I finished stitching closed the seam on the back, where I trimmed it and folded it 1/2 inch, and then I've just slip stitched it all the way down, and now I've put a knot in there to close up the end, and so I'm done with this seam. So you can see how nice and clean it looks when you've stitched it down. If you have a print fabric, it doesn't even show, basically. I usually get a busy print fabric to put on the back, and then you can't even see the seams, but here, because it's a solid, you can. So now I'm able to turn this piece over, and I can go back and quilt next to the sashing where I had left it unquilted so that I could open it up and get the sashing stitched in. So I've taken it over, went over to the machine, and I've just finished quilting this area right here. So you can see there's the end of my stitching. I went around here next to the sashing, and I've quilted that. And then this is where I quilted that little section, and I'm going to tie it off and knot it off on the back and hide my knots underneath. And that's how I go back and do it, so that I can finish all the quilting that's next to the sashing. And I'm actually going to quilt some in the sashing on this particular quilt.